Hello everyone. In this video I want to talk about prejudice and racism. And I always feel like there's never enough time and there's not enough ability to really cover this topic in such a short time. So I'm just giving you kind of an overview of some of the psychological aspects of prejudice and racism and give you a little bit of an understanding of why prejudice occurs and why racism can occur as well. We talked a little bit about group influence in the last lecture, and that definitely has a huge impact on prejudice and racism. We have in groups and out groups, and often people in that in group often do act in a discriminatory way against people that are not in their in group. And how can we change that? How can we prevent that? And we definitely can. So prejudice is when we hold a negative or hostile attitude towards a person, an individual, or a group of people. And that could be racism, but it doesn't always have to be racism. It could be ageism. We don't like older people or we don't like young people. Um, it could be against people that have different sexual orientations. It could be against a particular gender. So prejudice isn't just about racism, but certainly when we think of prejudice, that's what we think of. It could be prejudice against people with tattoos. And certainly, as human beings, we're kind of naturally judgmental, right? We're going to talk a little bit about how stereotypes are actually judgments and how that we naturally sort of develop stereotypes. So stereotypes are judgments or conclusions that we make about people that are different from us based on their group membership. So, based on whether their race or their religion or their age or their gender or their sexual orientation, we make a whole lot of assumptions about that. And, naturally, we try to develop concepts, we try to categorize information, and we try to categorize people. So when we meet somebody, say from Australia, what we do is we look at that concept of Australia and we think about all the things we know about Australia, which may not be a whole lot. Kangaroos. Mel Gibson, I think, is from Australia. I don't know. There's a lot of other actors probably too from Australia. So, and most of our viewpoints about Australians are positive, but it's still a stereotype, right? We sort of make these assumptions. Oh, Crocodile Dundee was another thing about Australians. We think about them being sort of rugged and out there in the wilderness, and, that's probably a minority of Australians, I would imagine. So even positive stereotypes, those sort of prevent us from really seeing the person as an individual. But naturally, when we meet somebody new, and especially somebody from a place that we're not really familiar with, we try to take all the information that we do have and we sort of apply it to them. People from Italy, we have ideas about what people from Italy are like. And then, of course, we have some pretty negative stereotypes about particular groups. Muslims, unfortunately, or people from the Middle East. We sort of lump all those people together without recognizing there's a vast difference between individuals from, say, Iran or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, all these different countries. And, the Middle East is such a large part of the world, and we sort of lump it together and we make a lot of negative assumptions. All the information that we have, or much of the information that we have about the Middle East, is negative. Terrorism, Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, all those kinds of things. We think of that and then we apply that negative information to an individual that we might assume a whole lot of bad things about that are totally not true. So, we naturally racist? Do we naturally stereotype people? And absolutely, we naturally stereotype people. We're trying to figure it out. We're trying to make sense of something new. We do have automatic assumptions that we make about people from different cultures, from different backgrounds. What we do is we take that knowledge that we have and we apply it to that person, and we make a lot of assumptions about that person before we even talk to that person. And one of the terrible things would be that it might prevent us from even bothering to talk to them, or at worst, it might cause us to act in a really bad way or really negative way towards that person. So we do have sort of this automatic and implicit bias. You hear this term a lot, so I wanted to bring it up a little bit. Implicit means unconscious. We talked about implicit memory when we talked about the memory chapter, and what it just means that we have these unconscious biases. And really what it is we have all this information stored about this particular race or group, and we take that information and we apply it automatically to that person, whether it fits or not. And what we have to do is really move beyond that information. So naturally, we have a lot of viewpoints just based on the knowledge that we have stored in our minds, right? And if that knowledge is negative, we really have to fight that negative knowledge to open our hearts and our minds to somebody that is from a country that we may not have positive information about. We also have to know that there is positive information, and that we don't really have very much knowledge, and especially about the Middle East. We only have a lot of terrible knowledge that we've heard on the news, and we don't always hear the about the everyday people and the good people that are there. So stereotypes are natural. We have to move beyond them, but what they do is they really devalue the individual, the person, even though they might appear to be positive. You know, people always think that Asians are super smart. Well, that seems like a positive stereotype, right? But what if you're Asian and you're not super smart? It might not be such a positive stereotype. So we're missing out on seeing the person when we stereotype people. But naturally, we are going to try to stereotype people. It's our natural way of trying to understand people. But we have to be really careful not to act on those stereotypes and to question those stereotypes that we develop in our mind, because they're not accurate. Oh, and I put Aunt Jemima up here because apparently they got rid of Aunt Jemima altogether, because think about it. This was like the original Aunt Jemima, and think about how racist this looks to us today. But at that time, people it didn't even see, nobody questioned it, nobody thought it was racist at all. And then they updated Aunt Jemima to this picture here, and then we've got Uncle Ben as well. I don't know if they still have Uncle Ben's rice or not. They probably changed it, and it's probably a good thing that they've changed it, because it marginalizes Black people into being cooks and chefs and things like that. And not that we all can be, we can all be good cooks. I'd like to be a good cook. But it's really a derogatory view of people of color. So I think it's really important that we change that. But the idea that back in the time when Aunt Jemima first came out, people didn't even see it as negative. And so that's kind of one of those automatic sort of implicit bias. It just, oh, of course, it's a Black woman that's our chef. And so, hopefully today people were definitely horrified by that. And I think we've come a long way as a society. But I still think there's a lot of negative attitudes and misunderstandings between races that still need some work. Um, and so this is talking a little bit about Islamophobia. We see somebody that a lot of times we assume, right after 9/11, this guy that was from India, he was a Sikh, I believe, and he had a turban that he wore. And he was shot and killed at a gas station right after 9/11 by this guy that thought he was a terrorist and thought he was from that part of the world, where I'm trying to think of what country the terrorists were even from. But anyway, he just made this assumption that he was from the Middle East and he must be a terrorist, and so he shot and killed him. Really ignorant and stupid. This guy was very peaceful, innocent, religious man, family man, had absolutely nothing to do with terrorism, and yet he was killed because of somebody's ignorance. So I think it's really important for us to educate ourselves and understand different parts of the world and different parts of the country, and recognize that we make a lot of assumptions about things, automatic assumptions about things, and we sort of feel like we're really right when a lot of times we're really wrong. So we got to be careful about that. So ageism, we don't really think of older people as being athletic, but that's not always true. Certainly there are skiers out there that are older. My husband just found out, I think it's age 70 above, you can get free skiing at Snow Bowl and many ski resorts, but there's not too many people out there that are still skiing at 70. Sexism, we make a lot of automatic assumptions about men and women. And, there's sometimes there's a little bit of truth to those stereotypes. And, it's not necessarily negative. We're just trying to understand each other and trying to understand the differences between us. And certainly we do have differences, but all women are not like this, all men are not like this. So we need to really look at each other as individual. So this is a little bit more about group membership as well, and prejudice and how that happens. But we learn prejudice from other people, right? And we also learn prejudice from different groups that we belong to. So our friends, our family, our social media, our community, even in school we learn things. So prejudice comes from learning, from social learning, and often from pressure to conform to our own group norms. So we often form what we call in-groups and out-groups. So we belong to particular groups, and that's our in-group. And then there are other groups out there that we don't belong to, and those are the out-groups. So we identify with certain groups, and that causes us to have my group and your group basically. And to simplify it, if you're a Cardinals fan and you meet a Cowboy fan, well, you already automatically have a whole lot of assumptions about that Cowboy fan. And if you're at the game between the Cardinals and the Cowboys is the enemy, right? And so we make a lot of negative viewpoints about those Cowboy fans. We say a lot of negative stuff. And sometimes we probably wouldn't say it to their face, but definitely just talking about Cowboy fans in general, we could say a lot of mean stuff, right? So what happens though is that we identify with that in group, and then a lot of times we either ignore that out group, or we might actually act in a discriminatory way against that out group. And we might also be so that out group sort of becomes the enemy, and that can really create prejudice. It's fine to have in groups and groups that you belong to and groups that you don't belong to, but when you identify too strongly with that in group and you discriminate against or eliminate that out group, and you think that out group is the enemy, that's where prejudice starts to come in. So ethnocentrism also leads to prejudice as well. And, it's kind of a confusing term in the sense that it's important to feel good about your own culture. And if you don't feel good about your own culture, then you don't feel good about yourself. And that's not a good thing. So it is really important to see the world from the perspective of your own ethnic group. And it's okay to think your group is the best, but it's not in that doesn't mean that other groups are not good or they're not as good. So my group is the best. That's ethnocentrism. That my in group is the best and the rest of you are trash. That's wrong. Um, so so ethnocentrism can be bad if you exclude other groups and you uh, put down other groups because they're not a member of your particular ethnic group. Egocentrism is really more of an individual thing. It's where you only see things from your own viewpoint. It hasn't happened to me, so it's not happening. I haven't witnessed racism, so it must not be happening anymore. Well, of course, you know, um, just because you haven't seen something happen does not mean that it isn't happening, right? Um, so we have to be aware that our personal experience can be really different from other people's personal experience. People, hear this a lot when we talk about the chapter 10 on people that are overweight. Often people who are not overweight are pretty judgmental about people that are overweight, and they sort of look at it only from their own perspective. I've never had trouble with my weight, or I can easily lose weight, so they can too if they just try, when they really have no understanding of what it's like to be overweight and how that happens and how difficult it often is to lose that weight. So egocentric is where you only see it from your viewpoint. Ethnocentric is where you think your culture and your ethnic group is the best and the rest of you are not. This is an example of ethnocentrism and kind of extreme ethnocentrism, and also ignorance as well. So this is the world according to Americans. I got this off the internet somewhere, and I almost hesitate to put it on here, but it's really sort of the simplified way people often look at different countries and different people. And this is really showing a lot of ignorance and a lot of ethnocentrism, that, the United States is not the only great place in the world. And one thing about reducing prejudice and racism is travel to other countries, and you'll see that the rest of the world is pretty nice. There's a lot of great places all around the world. And there certainly are some bad places. There's bad places places here in the United States, here in Arizona. Um, but there are many beautiful, wonderful places all around the world, and we tend to think that America is the best. So that's an ethnocentric view that's negative. It's one thing to think, it's one thing to be proud to be American, but it's another to think that we're better than everybody else. And that whole term American is really upsetting to people from South America, because South Americans are also Americans, and in the United States we just sort of take over that term and we're Americans. And well, South Americans, Central Americans are still Americans as well. So something to think about. Our country is great, but there are other countries that are great as well. So discrimination is when you show hostility or you deny service or care to someone because of their affiliation with a group or their ethnic background. So prejudice is an attitude that we have towards a group. Discrimination is an action that we have against a particular group. And it could be racial profiling, it could be scapegoating, where we blame a particular minority group for a societal problem. We think about illegal immigration and blame that for our economic problems. That's definitely not the case. So how can we reduce prejudice? One of the most important thing, one of the most, I'm trying to think of the way to say this, but equal status contact is where you are at an equal level with somebody, and interact with them on an equal level. So if you meet somebody from another country, you're both college students, you're both in psychology class, you're on an equal level, and you're much more likely to get to know each other as individuals rather than labeling that person as a particular group. A lot of times we avoid interacting with other groups, whereas if we're talking about individuals, we're on an equal level, we're maybe work together, we get to know each other as human beings and as individuals, and that really reduces prejudice a lot. So it's important for us to be aware of our biases, our automatic assumptions that we make about people, and our tendency to stereotype people. We want to look at people as individuals and not discount them based on their race, ethnic background, group membership. We want to intentionally interact and talk to people that are different from us and really be open to understanding different viewpoints. Ignorance absolutely increases prejudice. That infographic I showed you there definitely increases prejudice. And really learning about other cultures and traveling can be a really great way to understand that, although America is great, it's not the only place in the world that's great, and that there are many other cultures that are really important. And the one thing that is wonderful about the United States is the fact that we do have so many different cultures. I can't imagine what Arizona would be like without Mexican food, without Asian food. I can't imagine what our diet would be like if we had to be restricted to just American food, whatever that is. So I think that other cultures bring so much variety, and that's one thing that we should be proud of as Americans, that we do have a lot of diversity, and that's what makes us great. And I guess not everybody appreciates that as well as they should. So if you want to learn more about prejudice and racism, there are many courses here and at ASU, really discussing these kind of issues in much more depth than I can. There is a Psych 132, Psychology and Culture, which is an interesting class. It has a lot of information that you already learned here in Psych 101, but you can definitely take it. A lot of students like to take it because it qualifies for a social science, a humanities, and a culture class. So something to think about. There are sociology classes, 241s about race and ethnic relations. And like I said, sociology is much more of a bigger picture thing, so it's really interesting. There's also a communication class, intercultural communication. How do we communicate with people from different cultures? In psychology and culture, we look at, how do different cultures express emotion differently. There's a lot of different nuances that, are really important to understand and know, if you're going to be in a different country. There's also a class, CPD 160, Intro to Multiculturalism. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of understanding, I think, about multiculturalism, and really trying to understand our racial issues and really hopefully repairing a lot of these issues and making for a much better world. Thanks for listening.